watching on Zoom, thank you for your patience while we work through that right now. I want to welcome our speaker, Mr. David Dixon, who earned his Master's in History from the University of Massachusetts in 2003. His first book, for those of you that were here when he spoke on it, The Lost Gettysburg Address, tells the story, the very unusual story of Charles Anderson, who was actually from Texas, who spoke at the dedication of the National Cemetery after Lincoln did, and then all record of that seemed to have been lost for 140 years when a copy was found in a cardboard box in Wyoming. And Mr. Dixon did the necessary research to tell that story and return that story to the spotlight again. He gave a very excellent presentation on that when he was here the last time. But he does several other things. He's given nearly 100 talks. He hosts a website, B-List History, with obscure characters but compelling stories. He has spoken on podcasts as well, and readers can go to his website, www.daviddixon.com, to get copies of articles that he's written as well. His current book that he'll be speaking on this evening, Union General August Willich, originally from what is now Germany. So I know this will be an excellent presentation. David.
All right. Thanks so much, Jonathan. And while Bruce is getting everything set up, look how fast he is. Yeah, so thanks so much for having me. I know you had Eric Wittenberg last week. That's a pretty tough act to follow, or last month. I introduced Eric at a conference one time, and so I was giving his short biography, and I said, and Eric Wittenberg has published 26 books, and Eric raises his hand and says, excuse me, Dave, I published 32 books. So if you ever have the chance to introduce Eric Wittenberg, make sure that you're up to date. I think he has 2 new books out this year, so he's kind of on that Harold Holzer, David Powell thing where he's just pumping out the books. So the rest of us, it seems to take 4 or 5 years to do a book. So anyway, as Jonathan mentioned, I do biography primarily, so these obscure characters with really compelling stories. And August Willich's life certainly fits that bill. But I think biography can do a lot more. I think it can offer us an intimate window into aspects of the Civil War that go beyond the bullets on the battlefield. So today I'd like to challenge you to think differently about America's defining event. And I'd like to challenge you to it was working earlier. I'd like to challenge Bruce to sit next to it and advance it for me.
Let's see. Doesn't want to move at all. Oh, okay.
Oh, there it is. Did I do that? You did it?
Yeah, so. Try one more time. Can you advance one more?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
now
working.
it's working.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Appreciate it. So at 10 a.m. on April 7th, 1862, a brigade of Union soldiers from the Army of the Ohio rushed aboard the steamer John J. Roe at Savannah, Tennessee. They steamed upriver, then floated across and docked at a place called Pittsburgh Landing. As they disembarked, General Ulysses S. Grant ordered one regiment, the 32nd Indiana, to detach from their brigade and march immediately to the battlefield. And as they began this march, the regiment's brass band struck up their favorite tune to get them excited for battle. And the men sang at the top of their voices to this tune. And I want you to raise your hand once you can identify the name of this tune. You have to. Yeah? Raise your hand if raise your hand if you can hear it. Okay, yeah. So what is that tune? No? A Marseillaise, right. Or what is it, what's its official function now? That's right, the French national anthem. So, why are Union soldiers marching into battle singing the French national anthem? Why not the battle cry of freedom, or God Save the Union, or any one of 9,000 patriotic songs that were composed in the North during the Civil War? Perhaps even more confusing, this regiment, the 32nd Indiana, was composed almost entirely of German immigrants. Now, how do the Germans and French feel about each other in the middle of the 19th century? Anyone remember Napoleon? Franco-Prussian War? So when we read the English translation of these lyrics, it becomes even more puzzling. The typical Union soldier was not fighting tyranny or fearing that foreign invaders were about to murder their wives and children. Now, this stanza makes a little more sense at first glance, but wait a minute. This is early April 1862. The vast majority of Union soldiers have little interest in freeing the slaves. They are fighting to preserve the federal union. And who are these kings that want to enslave them? Now, to really understand why German Union soldiers, German American Union soldiers, I should say, are singing a French anthem and railing against the tyranny of kings and slavery, we need to change the way we've traditionally viewed the American Civil War. So this was not merely a sectional dispute, Northern brother fighting Southern brother over typically American issues. We need to adopt a more expansive, global view of the bloodiest conflict of the 19th century world. Now, a number of terrific historians have been doing work on this area, the U.S. Civil War through the global lens recently. These are two of my personal favorites. So I use the work of Don Doyle and Andre Flesch, among others, for context in my study of one particular German-American Civil War figure. So today I'd like to make three arguments. First, that the American Civil War was part of a long-term radical revolution focused on democratic government, workers' rights, and human freedom. This revolution was international in scope and unprecedented in world history. Secondly, recent immigrants in general, and German immigrants in particular, played a decisive role in the ultimate success of the Union Army. And finally, radical 48er leaders like August Willich helped transform a war to preserve the federal union into nothing less than social revolution, a revolution that was even more radical than the revolution of 1776. Now, when we talk about radicals in their revolutions in the 18th century, one man stands head and shoulders above the rest in terms of influence. Thomas Paine's classic Common Sense, which he published in 1776, sold more than 100,000 copies. This remains the largest selling book in U.S. history proportional to population. So Paine inspired the American founders to pursue independence rather than simply a redress of their grievances against the English crown. He also claimed that this conflict was about human rights and social justice. And here's what Paine said: "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind." He went on to say, quote, "My country is the world and my religion is to do good." Now, the American Revolution that Paine helped inspire was certainly radical from a political perspective. The overthrow of a hereditary monarch being replaced by a democratic republic was nothing short of transformational. but it stopped well short of the ideals of social justice and equality that were envisioned by Paine and promised in the Declaration of Independence. So the American Revolution may have been a political earthquake, but it left social relations in the new country virtually unchanged. The theme of a political revolution conceived and executed by social elites like Washington was reflected in the international leaders who supported the Patriot cause. So these three men, these three foreign generals, were aristocrats, and they were fighting for political freedom, not social re-engineering. Well, Thomas Paine ends up at France, and French radicals waste little time in emulating the success of their American allies. And they instituted an ambitious, sweeping social revolution. But they really overreached in adopting the most radical aims of Enlightenment philosophers. They believed that perfect equality ought to be imposed on the entire populace, whether they were ready for not. And these romantic dreams of a new social order soon devolved into a macabre nightmare. The American Revolution, on the other hand, had been carefully planned. It was carried through with a conventional army and had relatively limited aims. The French Revolution, in contrast, was led by incohesive gangs of rioters. And of course, the result was chaos and terror. And the new French Republic soon disintegrated as popular General Napoleon Bonaparte consolidated his power and became Emperor of France. The first half of the 19th century witnessed a dramatic shift from a society of rural farmers and artisans to a workforce that was increasingly factory-based. So instead of having control of one's own labor and production, capitalists now controlled most industries, and workers were paid in wages. Periodic harvest failures and the reluctance of rulers to consider liberal reforms increased the pressure on the kings and princes of Europe. And an outgrowth of French revolutionary socialism that was dubbed communism was gaining support among middle-class intellectuals. So these tensions between conservative elites and liberal reformers finally came to a head in the watershed year 1848, where, as you might expect, all the trouble started in Paris. So on a windy, gray February morning, thousands of unemployed Parisians assembled on the Place de Madeleine. They were soon joined by 700 students who crossed the Seine singing, "Thank you." So before long, street fighting ensued. Barricades were erected, and just 2 days later, King Louis Philippe abdicated. And the rebels took turns sitting on his throne. One scrawled this note: "The people of Paris to all of Europe, liberty, equality, and fraternity." Then they took the chair to the Bastille and they burned it. And out of those ashes rose the Second French Republic. So despite the fact that there was no internet, no Twitter, news of this French revolt spread like wildfire. And if you look on the map, everywhere where you see a star is a place where these revolts spontaneously combusted, really. But after some initial success, they were basically all crushed by reactionary forces, and then royal prerogative was reinstated. France was the very last to submit when Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew crowned himself emperor. Shortly before these uprisings, Auguste von Willich renounced his nobility and resigned from a 17-year career with the Prussian army. And he became one of the key leaders in the revolutions in the southern German states. There was no Germany, of course, at this time. So he fought in 3 rebellions, in the southern Rhineland and in Baden before taking refuge in France, Switzerland, London, and then finally in America. So in the face of so many of these failed democratic revolts in their homelands, these political refugees sought a place where they could live out their principles of free popular government and then eventually return to Europe and reignite the revolutions. Now, the America where most of these dissidents settled was hardly the fulfillment of the French Revolution's promise of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. America was indeed a free country, and it offered economic opportunities that were largely absent in Europe. But it was just as socially stratified as the old country. So instead of an aristocracy of royal privilege, we had an aristocracy of wealth. A large established base of American-born nativists resented this flood tide of European immigration, and of course this huge permanent underclass of enslaved people were treated more like farm animals. So once political refugees like Willich realized that further hope for revolution in Europe had evaporated, most of these folks made their way to America and committed themselves to try to create a more perfect republic here. Like many of his fellow 48ers, Willich edited a German language newspaper in Cincinnati. This happened to be the first daily labor newspaper in any language in American history. In his opening editorial, Willich vowed to, quote, support those reforms that are supposed to make this republic a truth for everyone. Besides his tireless efforts to promote labor unions and trade associations, Willich also formed alliances with local black leaders. And this caused him considerable trouble, even put his life in jeopardy, when he led a multiracial torchlight procession to protest the execution of John Brown. He also developed this original idea to transform the United States into a workers' republic. His proposal would eliminate the Congress and replace it with a national trades assembly, eliminating political parties and moving the country closer to, in his opinion, its founding ideals, a true social republic, as he called it. Now, this was at best a novel and perhaps naive concept, and at worst, a radical and dangerous idea in the minds of most conservatives. Now, Willich welcomed the coming of the American Civil War, not to preserve the Federal Union, but to create a social revolution that would defeat the slaveholding aristocracy in the southern states, preserve democracy and republican government, and secure the triumph of free labor. He hoped that this in turn would lead to better working conditions and perhaps even a revision of this relationship between labor and capital. Willich dreamed that worker exploitation of all kinds would vanish and that what he called wage slavery would be replaced by a more fair value for value exchange. Now, exiled radicals from all over the Western world, and this is just a few examples, supported the Union war effort. So as you can see, Russia, Cuba, Spain were represented, along with 140,000 Irish immigrants that called Thomas More their hero. Immigrants from Norway and other Scandinavian countries had their own ethnic regiments, like the 15th Wisconsin of Willich's own brigade. Hungarians and Canadians fought for the Union. And Prussian revolutionary Karl Schurz became perhaps the most accomplished German American of all time after serving alongside Willich in Baden. If you look at the numbers, the impact of immigrants and blacks combined on Union victory in the Civil War is indisputable. Together, they represented the majority of federal soldiers who fought in the Civil War. And foreign-born soldiers alone accounted for 25% of the Union Army's manpower, even though the male population was less than 13% of the population. Immigrants from the German states, particularly in the southwest of the German states where most of these rebellions took place, numbered more than 200,000. And many joined regiments that were either predominantly or exclusively German-speaking. And they shared characteristics that made them unusually successful soldiers. So first of all, they were on average 2 years older than their native-born counterparts. Many of them came from Turner societies, so these were German social clubs that emphasized rigorous physical fitness and military-style drilling. Many in the officer class had actual combat experience via those revolutions in 1848. This was something that most of the farm boys, volunteers, totally lacked any military experience. And finally, their concentration in urban areas made them unusually resistant to disease and camp. And many were either strongly anti-slavery or full-fledged abolitionists like Willich. And they were highly motivated to finish what they had started in Europe. And for Willich and other recent immigrants, 1861 was 1848, all over again. In his words, it involved, quote, the same rights of men against a combined conspiracy of a traitorous slave aristocracy with the same powers of the old world. And these German Americans were also anxious to prove that they belonged here in this country in the midst of virulent and sometimes even violent anti-immigrant sentiment. So Willich himself recruited 4 companies and first joined the all-German 9th Ohio Infantry out of Cincinnati. But by the summer of 1861, he was awarded his own command. And here we see Willich in the front here. This man in the middle, his Lieutenant Colonel, Henry von Treba, actually fought against him in the revolutions of 1848. This man on the right, Carl Schmidt, was his aide in the revolutions of 1848 and his adjutant with the 32nd. He was also his adjutant when he became a brigadier. So Willich's men called him Papa, and he referred to them as my little children or my fellow citizens. And for a long time, Willich refused to hire a chaplain. And when they forced one on him, that particular reverend lasted just 6 weeks. So Willich conducted graveside services himself, often ending by stressing that theirs was not a conflict over nationality, but a war that was in the interest of all humanity. Now, you may be a bit disappointed, but I'm not going to take you on a blow-by-blow description of Willich's accomplishments either in the European revolutions or in the American Civil War. I actually have 10 chapters, 8 maps in this book that I think do a pretty good job of that. But for a little flavor of just what kind of commander this man was, let's return to the battlefield at Shiloh, where we last left Willich and his troops singing. Thank you. So they arrive on the Stacy Field, where Willich is supposed to be held in reserve, but he immediately requests and is granted permission to pass to the front and make a bayonet charge. Before they moved, Willich addressed his troops. Little children, today decides the fate of America. Then a shell burst overhead. If we are beaten today, everything is lost. Let us do our duty as free men do. So Willich made 5 successive charges, changing front 9 times in the process. And despite this display of technical agility, his troops got overexcited and outran their support on both flanks. So what does Willich do? He halts them, he rides around to the front of his column, and with his back to the enemy, drills them in the manual of arms exercise to help calm them. In the meantime, soldiers are dropping in the ranks from enemy fire. He repeats this same feat 18 months later at Chickamauga. And Lew Wallace later described it as the most audacious act of bravery he had witnessed in the entire war. Upon his death, the New York Times penned an extraordinary tribute to the general, calling him, quote, undoubtedly the ablest and bravest officer of German descent engaged in the War of Rebellion. But in an immediate sense, Willich actually failed in 2 of the 3 great causes of his life. He and his fellow revolutionaries did not defeat the princes and kings of Europe, nor did they create a unified German democratic republic. And Willich's unceasing efforts to turn the American political system into a social republic where workers controlled the means of production and received full value for their labor never gained serious traction. Now, his efforts to recruit and lead immigrant volunteers did help defeat the slave-holding aristocracy in the southern states, but this vision that Willich and Lincoln shared of a more perfect Republican nation was a lofty goal that would probably take generations to accomplish. No, by 1865, it was the Radicals who had won the American Civil War. This precious but fragile republic had not been defeated. That result would have delighted the princes and kings of Europe. Rather, popular government proved viable and resilient. And it would take several years, but eventually most of Europe would follow America's example and either abolish the monarchy or make it purely ceremonial. The largest slaveholding empire in the world vanished virtually overnight. And with it, $3.5 billion in property. This was more than the combined value of all U.S. manufacturing and railroads combined. That's $105 billion in lost property in today's dollars. So talk about radical economic change. Equally significant was the fact that America would have to transition to a free labor economy virtually overnight. So radicals like Willich foresaw better working conditions, labor reforms, but it really didn't work out that way because the Civil War stalled the labor union movement and it took decades for them to regain their pre-war momentum. The most radical outcome of the American Civil War, however, was the transformation of chattel slaves into American citizens. And this held the most promise for epic change. And for a time, the entire social hierarchy in the southern states was turned upside down, with black men serving in Congress while many white elites were stripped of the franchise. But of course, that all ended, and radical Reconstruction was replaced with conservative reaction, and we are still trying to erase the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow here more than 150 years later. Historian Eric Foner writes, "The enduring challenges for radicals is they must be willing to fight and lose for a long time before even achieving partial success. So military men like Willich came from the well-educated German middle class, but they grew to resent aristocratic dominance. They also resented the forces of rapid industrialization that robbed working people of their independence and their dignity, and threatened to consign them, perhaps, to a permanent underclass. Their commitment to change and their frustration with intractable rulers pushed them into radicalism and rebellion. And the reddest of the red, as Willich was called by both his friends and his foes, clung stubbornly to his violent means and radical prescriptions. So, even after such measures had failed, he still didn't give up on these cherished democratic socialist principles. So he and other leaders emigrated from Germany or the German states in the hopes that they would find a warmer reception for their ideas here in America. And this made some sense, this export of German revolutionaries and their ideology to America, because after all, radicals throughout Europe at this time had been working in concert for a small r Republican vision that really transcended national borders. And the multicultural United States of America seemed a perfect place to try to continue that struggle. So Willich changed course from system overthrow to extensive reform through existing channels. And he positioned the German-American sacrifice in the Civil War as an international human rights crusade in frequent speeches to his troops. After the war was over, the general advised Union veterans to remain vigilant in the wake of victory and urged them to support revolutions in the Old World. And here's what he said: "No temporary peace will undo the revelations of the times. Soon the voice of the people will be heard claiming the rights of men." And then he urged his listeners to, quote, "wave the American banner of human liberty above the storm as a pilot light for the struggling nations." Pioneering German sociologist Max Weber once wrote, quote, "What is possible never would have been achieved in this world if people had not reached for the impossible." So 19th century proposals like an 8-hour workday, unemployment benefits, child labor laws, all once maligned as radical assaults on American institutions, became mainstream public policy in the 20th century. So activists like Willich, who promote such far-reaching reform, are often forced to wait decades or perhaps even centuries for favorable conditions and moments to occur. And most of these extreme ideas never come to fruition. So circumstance and environment forced Willich to change his tactics at times, but his core principles never changed. In fact, they formed this prism through which he viewed everything, including the American Civil War. And here's what he said to a fellow German-American officer in 1862. "Encouraging and promoting a solution to the social question is and will remain the only task of my life. This work alone not only makes life more challenging for me, but in my view, also gives it value." So what are the larger lessons we can learn from the radical nature of the American Civil War? Well, first of all, such revolutionary social, political, and economic change usually happens incrementally over long periods of time, right? But occasionally, radical actors can provide an emotional spark that, given the right timing and circumstances, can create a tipping point event. And I think you may agree with me that John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, for example, is an example of one such tipping point event, right? So Brown's extreme act made it much easier for radical secessionists to convince many of their fellow Southerners that Lincoln's election represented yet another such existential threat. Those failed revolutions in Europe in 1848 actually provided rationale for radicals on both sides of the secession question. As I've argued, these radical 48er revolutionaries were a key part of Lincoln's core constituency and one of many reasons he was able to transform a war to save the Federal Union into a moral crusade for human rights and free labor. Now, on the other hand, the idea that the people should be able to determine their own form of government, in other words, popular sovereignty versus the divine right of kings, this was used by Southern radicals to justify their breakaway slaveholding republic. So I believe that this helps explain why at critical moments in history, like the American Civil War, radicals from opposing sides of a crisis are able to exert influence and even accelerate events, despite the fact that the vast majority of the population holds moderate or even conservative views. So the sectional crisis in the US is just one example of a pattern that keeps repeating when issues of global importance reach their tipping points. In the 18th and 19th centuries, political crises took center stage with the American and French revolutions, the revolts of 1848, and of course, the American Civil War. All of these laid the groundwork for the crumbling of monarchy in the Western world, at least, and the emergence of the modern nation state. In the 20th century, ethnic nationalism and economic crises brought other radicals to the fore. So communists like Lenin, Stalin, and Mao co-opted and perverted the theories of philosophers like Karl Marx and created repressive, authoritarian regimes that in many ways were the antithesis of Marx's original ideas. Radical fascists like Hitler converted ethnic pride into murderous ethnic cleansing. And radical presidents like Franklin Delano Roosevelt used the Great Depression as a rationale for his ambitious New Deal legislation, which included dozens of initiatives that were decried as socialist by his rivals. But of course, by the end of the 20th century, we had Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicare, huge public utilities, all now bedrocks of a social safety net that would have been unthinkable to mainstream Americans in the 19th century. Here in the 21st century, crises like pollution, terrorism, climate change, world hunger, and substance abuse top the list of global concerns. And radicals on all sides of these important questions are jockeying for position as their ability to influence the masses is magnified by social media. At some unknown point in the future, these pressing and universal issues, like those that created the American Civil War, will reach a tipping point. And when they do, expect that radicals will emerge from the fringes of society and become well-known names throughout the world. We can only hope that they have studied history and understand that they have a responsibility to act in the interest of all humankind to create positive and lasting change. Thank you. This is the ubiquitous commercial for the book, but let's have some questions because this is a very unusual character, and I hope I've had a somewhat provocative talk for you, so let's have some questions. Yes, Bruce.
David, I was doing a few figures here. About 250,000 German-born people serving in the Union.
Well, 216,000 is the most current estimate, and that would be a combination of people that were born in Germany or sons of people that were born in Germany and came over, right? Because if they came over, say in 1848, that was 13 years later. It's 1861. So some of those children that came over were in the war, and then some of the people that were born in 1848, of course,
I understand,
Yeah.
What percentage, in your opinion, were actual 48ers?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say most estimates say that the 48ers was a pretty small group. There was only maybe about 10,000 of them. So when I say 48ers, these would have been the political refugees like Willich, right? Because the vast majority of these German and Irish and other immigrants that are coming over are not coming over because they're political refugees like Willich, right? They're coming over for economic opportunity, right? And they're coming over for a whole bunch of reasons. But I will contend that the radical 48er leaders, like Franz, let's just do the Germans, like Franz Siegel, like Karl Schurz, like August Willich, these people had outsized influence, right? They were almost all doing German language newspapers at the time. They were in some cases, like Siegel, icons of their immigrant communities. Thomas More certainly was for the Irish, right? So they had outsized influence on their peers. So when the call from Lincoln came, especially the Germans, the Irish were a little bit later to answer that call than the Germans, but the Germans were signing up, like I said, Willich, 4 companies himself immediately. So yeah. Mr. Fink. Fine, sorry.
Thank you, David. I enjoyed your talk very much. But my understanding was that the immigrants to the United States in the 19th century typically were affiliated with the Democratic Party rather than with the Republican.
True.
And so that poses a problem in terms of how Lincoln served to motivate them.
Yeah, so there's a great book by Harold Holzer. He's only written like 48 books on Lincoln. But Harold wrote a book about 5 years ago called Lincoln and the Power of the Press. It's really an excellent book. So it talks about how Lincoln suppressed, the unfriendly presses during the war, and it talks about how he tried to use the press to influence. So one of the things that Lincoln did in secret, well before he was nominated for president, which kind of shows that he had ambitions, was he bought in secret a German language newspaper, because that's how he felt about the German influence. So, but you're right, most of these immigrants, particularly the Irish, but also the Germans, were predominantly Democratic. So they had to convince, people like Karl Schurz were barnstorming all over the country trying to get these Germans to join the Republican Party, and they did to some extent. Now, to what extent? The majority of them still remain Democrats. However, a large number went to the Republican Party, and in some of the states where we are now, they made a significant difference when it came to the 1860 election. So, but you are right; they were primarily Democrat. There were some, without going too far into it, there was also, of course, religious factors that played into that too, right? So certainly the Irish Catholics and the German Catholics, very much Democrats, right? Yes.
I have an odd question.
Sure.
But most of the German immigration came through New Orleans.
Came where?
Came through New Orleans, and New Orleans has a huge.
What time period are you talking about?
It was indentured. German immigration remained indentured until 1830.
Right.
So they were.
The early, yeah, okay.
They were forced. The Germans were in many ways forced to stay in the South. That split. Do you have any comments on the Germans of the Confederacy, since there were so many of them?
Yeah, well, there weren't that many of them. So if you took all of, and I got this figure from Doug Dummett actually when I visited his special exhibit today. So according to his research, and I think I've seen similar figures, if you took all of the foreign-born soldiers in the Confederate Army, you're talking only about 10,000 or so. So it's not a very big number. You had a lot of German Unionists in Texas, for example. And to your earlier point, yeah, I mean, the immigration figures depends on what time period you're talking about. So if you're talking about the period from, say, right after the 1848 revolution up to the Civil War, the port of New York by far is the biggest port of entry for those folks. And I would guess that Baltimore is probably the second largest port of entry, and then maybe New Orleans at that time. But it varied, from time to time. So yeah, it's all complicated, right? I mean, it's all, you can try to make these broad brushstroke statements, but yes, sir.
Like, for example, German immigrants, a lot of them Republicans.
Say that again, sir?
Like, for example, the German immigrants, weren't a lot of them Republicans?
Yes, yes. Yeah, they were. I mean, the 48er leaders were predominantly Republican. To this gentleman's point earlier, though, the run-of-the-mill average immigrant would have still been majority Democrat and stayed majority Democrat. But enough of them moved over to the new Republican Party, partly because of opposition to slavery, right? Not as much in Missouri, that's a slave state, it's a border state, but you get up into this neck of the woods and the Germans are seriously anti-slavery. They may not have been abolitionists, and they may not have been willing to put their life on the line to defeat slavery, but they certainly, you can look at the Germans in Texas, for example, and see how odious slavery was to the Germans in the Hill Country, for example. And a lot of them were persecuted or left Texas because they refused to fight for a slaveocracy. Somebody else? Yes, Mark.
A couple of questions. One, since I couldn't quite get the color coding, you had some percentages there about the percentages of immigrants and African Americans.
Yeah.
What is the?
So it's 25% immigrants, 18% immigrant sons. So that would have been sons of immigrants that were born here. There's a lot of people, a lot of revolutionists, for example, came over in 1830, not just 1848. So if you came over in 1830 and your father was a red-hot revolutionist, and then you would have come of age. 9% are the blacks. So if you add that, and then 48% are native-born white people. So I don't know about you, but when I first ran these numbers, I was a little surprised. I didn't realize.
The 48% are native whites.
Native whites, yes, yeah. So and let's face it. Look at the history. The historiography of the Civil War. That story has not been told to the extent that it really should be told. I think the black history has started to be told much better, but the immigrant history, I got to tell you, is still in its infancy, in my opinion. So.
Well, we know a lot about. Cincinnati, St. Louis,
right, Milwaukee.
All German towns.
Absolutely.
And they joined up early and often.
Yeah, it's interesting to compare the behavior, for example, the German immigrants and the Irish immigrants, right? So in 140,000 Irish immigrants served. So I'm not denigrating the service of the Irish immigrants, but these are two completely different animals, right? You have highly educated, the most literate area in Europe by far at this time were the German states, right? So you have this highly literate middle-class artisans coming over here from Germany, and you have people like my ancestors, which were dirt farming, tenant farmers in Ireland, right? Who didn't own anything, who many of whom were illiterate. So there's just and we're very heavily Catholic, very staunchly Catholic, and so there's just a lot of things going on because a lot of the Germans coming over are free thinkers, right? There's of course a lot of Protestants and Catholics too, but there's a lot of free thinkers that really, like Willich, who detest organized religion in general.
Do you think that is just the legacy of the Irish Brigade and its involvement in battles versus the 11th Corps in the Army of the Potomac?
Well, I think the fellow from the Army College, I think the myth of the Flying Dutchman has been pretty much dispelled. Christian Keller, right? So I think if you read Christian Keller on Chancellorsville, I think you'd probably achieve a more balanced view. But think about this nativism. The nativism was running strong up to the Civil War. Then it kind of cools off and everybody kind of comes together. But these attitudes don't go away. And so, boy, here when some of these officers who have those attitudes see the opportunity, and the people in the press see that opportunity to blame the immigrant, we're going to blame the immigrants, and that's what I mean. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Carl Schurz and Franz Sigel were not the most highly accomplished major generals in the Union Army by any stretch, right? But yeah, that.
But the overall work of German soldiers, I think, was perhaps overlooked because of that.
I think, well, because of that, I think World War I, World War II, certainly, I must tell you from a personal perspective, as a non-German speaker, I mean, unless you've got some really good help here as a scholar, you are not going to tackle this, because it is the German script is almost impossible to read. It's mostly 80 and 90-year-olds are reading it, because not too many young people can read it. Fraktur print, not so great, right? Yes, sir. You had a comment?
Yes, I agree that the prejudices against the immigrant hardly died out in the Civil War.
Right.
Let me give you briefly, and I'll be very brief.
Mm-hmm.
Two World War II, well, not one of them didn't serve in World War II. The two 20th century generals. The first was George Patton,
Mm-hmm.
who, while he had certain prejudices against Jews, blacks, and others, he was willing to give individuals from those groups a chance to show what they could do in his outfit.
Yeah.
Compare him with George Van Horn Mosley, who served in the 1930s and who was anti-immigrant to the point where even somebody like General MacArthur was skeptical of him.
Yeah, it was a big problem. Bruce?
Has there ever been a work done on the people from Germany who came to America, fought the Civil War, who fought against the Revolution of 1848? There had to be at least this.
Yeah, there are several books. Most of them were written in German and translated later into English. And there are some excellent books that treat the 48ers as a group and then give individual biographies of the leaders, and the one.
About the people's fought for the governments and the kings.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, as best as we can, we've outlined their biographies before they came over, but it's kind of an imperfect science. I mean, those of you that have done family history, I mean, that's maybe the hardest part, is like getting over the ocean and finding the ancestor over there. It's kind of hard, and most of these historians are not like genealogists, right? So I mean, we do know, but as far as the percentages, I don't know, but I will say that the ones that I'm familiar with, of those 10,000 48ers that we mentioned earlier, that top tier that fit with the Siegels and the Schurz, et cetera, they were overwhelmingly revolutionists in 1848. But like I mentioned, his lieutenant colonel fought against them, right? So there were. As in anything else, there's a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum as far as allegiances. There's a spectrum in terms of what people are willing to do. Willich is willing to sacrifice everything, right? He's abandoned his nobility. He's alienated his family. His brother his brother fought against him too. After the war, he goes back to Berlin trying to patch up the relationship with his brother, and it doesn't go very far, because some things can't be forgiven if you've I don't want to bring up a controversial subject, but it's like Lee. It's like when Lee makes his decision to resign, right? I mean, that's what Willich did, right? He pledged his loyalty to the king, and he went back on his oath, right? And he alienated his family, and he left his country. Those are really hard things to forgive, I think. Yes.
Willich die?
So Willich died in 1878 in a small town in Ohio called St. Mary's. It's in really central Ohio. Small little German community. Of course, his funeral was the biggest thing that town had ever seen. It was the biggest thing that county had ever seen until Neil Armstrong, who came from Poconetka, right down the road from them. So those are the two. Still to this day, I spoke at the St. Mary's Library last month, and I mean, to this day, it's Neil Armstrong and August Willich. And you don't have to go too far out of St. Mary's when nobody's ever heard of August Willich, right? But in St. Mary's, he's still a local celebrity.
So I was thinking, if he had been alive, during our Haymarket riot, one of the martyrs, he was hanged, was a German newspaper publisher.
Right.
And so he, obviously they would have been like-minded.
Yeah, and possibly would have known each other. I don't know.
He,
I mean,
he was deceased before that.
when Willich was running the Republikaner, the German language newspaper in Cincinnati, there were 5 German language newspapers in Cincinnati. I mean, think about that. That's incredible. And of course, they're not. And Willich's paper is a labor. It's a working man's paper, free subscription, right? 3 of the 5 were staunchly Democratic, and they fought just like the Democratic and Republican papers of the native-born Americans did. So I'm talking about a 48-year leader here, and I do not want to give you any type of picture that paint with a broad brush that says all these guys were abolitionists or all these people were this way. I mean, it's certainly an individual thing, but leaders like radicals, as I tried to argue in the talk, they can exert outsized influence on people and really change events or create events. So, all right, I think that's the signal. I'm getting the signal. We're done here.